test, test, test. Hello, hello, test. Welcome to the live room here at Conservatorium Maastricht at the Jazz Department. Soon we will start watching the first Jazz Master Research presentation of today, which is a video presentation of Rouzanna Coxson, after which we will return back here in the live room for Q&A. Thank you.
Okay. Picture a world where the vibrant rhythms of South African jazz entangle with the melancholic melodies of Armenian folk music. Here, as these vibrant musical traditions entwine, a crossroads emerges. This captivating journey of exploration forms the essence of my thesis titled Cultural Crossroads, a Journey of Exploration in South African Jazz and Armenian Folk Music. Hello, goeiedag, molweni, and barev. I'm Rouzanna, and today I'd like to invite you to join me on a quest that delves into the reasoning behind my research, the insightful process I undertook, the remarkable results I achieved, and the surprises that unfolded along the way. But before we embark on this musical journey, let me share a quote from the great Bill Evans. He once said, "You give up your own personality when you imitate somebody." I have long been a listener of Bill's music, so these words resonated within me. To me, they capture the importance of cultivating a unique artistic identity. This ignited a flame of curiosity, compelling me to explore my own sound and artistic identity, a journey that laid the foundation for my research. Welcome to my thesis presentation. I grew up in a bicultural home, and I've always felt the need to gain a deeper understanding of my identity, and more specifically, how it relates to my music making. Although I was born and raised in South Africa, I was not brought up in a traditional South African household. My dad is South African and my mom is Armenian, so I've been fortunate enough to experience a blend of these two cultures growing up, and I strongly identify with both. I have, however, found myself asking many questions about my identity, as I did not feel that I completely fit into either context entirely. Although this was primarily due to cultural factors, I also began to question my musical identity in recent years. It is for this reason that my research is very personal. My research topic proposes new ways in which Armenian folk music and South African jazz can be expressed through original compositions, while also delving deeper into the development of both musical styles. Through my research, I aim to find creative ways in which I can utilize elements of South African jazz and Armenian folk music across compositional forms. To achieve this goal, I came up with 3 sub-questions that define my workflow. Number 1, what are the core elements of Armenian folk music? Number 2, what are the core elements of South African jazz? And number 3, how can the elements of these styles be implemented creatively into compositional practice? The first 2 sub-questions were carried out collaboratively, which provided me with the necessary tools to achieve the third sub-question. Then came the now what part of my research. I had my aim and my sub-questions, but I still needed to create a clear method that would assist me in achieving optimal results. I did manage to create a rather interesting method. However, it can be a little confusing to explain, so I'm going to do my best. When developing my method, I came across the term performative research. This is seen as an addition to the commonly used qualitative and quantitative methods. The author Brad Haseman argues that an artwork embodies research findings which are symbolically expressed, even while not conveyed through numbers or words, which are themselves symbols. In terms of artistic research, it is often true that findings cannot be presented scientifically due to the personal nature of the topic. The context of my thesis draws upon the interest in culture, specifically in the understanding of my own bicultural upbringing, and is therefore entirely personal. This aspect of artistic research lends itself to intuition within the creative process. Performative research involves 2 types of methods, practice-based and practice-led. Although it seems that different authors use different terminology, so it can be a little bit confusing to understand. These methods often go hand in hand and are carried out collaboratively. Generally speaking, if a creative artifact is the basis of the contribution to knowledge, the research is practice-based. However, if the research leads primarily to new understandings about practice, it is then practice-led. My project used a practice-based approach aligned with the anti-clockwise steps of the iterative cyclic web. This tool helps document abstract findings and experimentation that occur during the creative process. Through this method, I created compositions to explore the use of elements across different musical styles. The resulting musical compositions are considered as the central artifacts and contributors of knowledge. In addition to the iterative cyclic web, I also made use of exploratory design, action-driven, and descriptive design processes. It was a diverse range of these approaches used to uncover the complexities of the music and its connection to the research. Now that we have established that my research is practice-based, I would like to get into the more interesting part of the methods. As I mentioned previously, I made use of theoretical and practical processes. The theoretical approaches mostly answered sub-question 1 and 2, whereas the practical approach answered sub-question 3. I'm going to draw a mind map now to better explain these methods. To even begin to answer the first two sub-questions, I needed to do a little bit of research into the musical styles that I wanted to incorporate into my compositions. This brings me to the first part of my method, reviewing articles and literature. An investigation into South African jazz and Armenian folk music was necessary to form an understanding of each of their distinctive musical elements, as well as their historical development. I analyzed articles, literature, and audiovisual materials through process of reading, listening, and note-taking. I also created an online blog to record my findings and observations, which I will discuss later in this presentation. The next part of my method involved analyzing listening material. This process provided insights into how the elements of Armenian folk music and South African jazz are implemented and used in context. It also provided input into the musicians who perform these styles, their influence, as well as the instrumentation. I created this template to assist in the analysis. The last step of the listening process involved transcribing sections of music that I found interesting and relevant to my research. Sometimes this was in the form of a lead sheet with melody and chords, but sometimes it was simply a 4-bar rhythmic pattern. Here's an example of a tune Chisa that I transcribed, where I transcribed the lead sheet with the melody and the chords. And then here's a transcription of a rhythmic element that I thought was interesting, and it's simply a 4-bar rhythmic pattern. These descriptive design processes assisted in the investigation of material, as well as in the interpretation and fusion of new ideas. However, it is important to note that while there is information on Armenian folk music and South African jazz, there is no research available for the combination of these two styles in a compositional context. It is for this reason that the methods used to conduct this research are highly exploratory. The previous steps that I just mentioned form a part of the academic research section in the iterative cyclic web. After analyzing listening material, I then moved on to the more practical methods. This brings me to my next step, which is the process of composing, and it is the more exciting part of the method. After gathering enough information from the literature and the listening material, I started composing short musical phrases in response to the material. The length of these responses ranged from 4 bars to 12 bars and incorporated some of the elements heard from the recordings. To better organize my compositional process, I consciously limited myself to one style per week, and I alternated between South African jazz and Armenian folk music. This allowed for a more focused approach to each style, particularly in the beginning stages of the compositional process. The phrases composed during this stage were then incorporated into slightly longer compositional sketches, each of which was inspired by flowers in mythology and folklore, which I'll discuss shortly. The sketches were then merged into compositions where I experimented with a fusion of elements across both styles. These made use of complementary and contrasting elements inherent in South African jazz and Armenian folk music. The final step in the compositional process was to solidify the experimental ideas to produce complete compositions. Through this process, I found that my compositional sketches were a little too mechanical and lacked the creative essence of telling a story through music. It is for this reason that each composition is inspired by a mythological story about a flower. These flowers are native to South Africa and Armenia, and they aided in the thematic approach as well as added a personal touch to the music. The final part of my method that I'd like to discuss is the documentation. However, this step, I believe, exists outside of the iterative cyclic web because I was documenting my research as I was going along. So I created an online blog to document my process. This website includes information on the different styles, the analysis of listening material, compositional sketches, and the recordings made during the research process. This element assisted in recording my observations as well as in holding me accountable for my own development. The result culminated in 6 compositional artifacts. I'm going to briefly discuss the important results of sub-question 1 and 2, but my focus for this presentation will be on the results of sub-question 3, which involves the combining of findings in sub-question 1 and 2 through compositions. Starting with sub-question 1, what are the core elements of Armenian folk music? Much of what we know about Armenian folk music is thanks to the musicologist Komitas Vardapet. He transcribed many of the folk tunes and later harmonized them. Armenian folk music initially started out as a monophonic tradition. This was due to the influence of the church, where the church believed that God is one and should therefore be represented by one voice. This, however, changed as Western notation became more popular in Armenia, and Komitas started experimenting with harmonizing these folk melodies. Today, most of his transcriptions and harmonizations are what is taken as standard in the Armenian folk repertoire. Armenian folk melodies often sound minor and make use of various diatonic modes. The most common mode is the Phrygian mode. These melodies also make use of various intervals, with the minor second being the most popular interval, and then it also uses the perfect fourth and perfect fifth intervals. Armenian folk melodies are often in 3, with the first note of each bar being short and accented. It is also very common to make use of mixed meters or odd meter within these melodies, and this is famously heard in Aram Khachaturian's music. It is also very common for a folk melody to be in free time. Regarding the form of Armenian folk music, most of the tunes make use of a theme and variation. This is where the melody is stated in its entirety, followed by repetitions that differ slightly from each other. The final element that I'd like to mention is the use of pedal points. Through transcribing various folk tunes and listening to Aram Khachaturian's music, I noticed that there were quite a few pedal points used, and I have tried to use this in my compositions, which I will discuss a little bit later. When researching Armenian folk music, I came across a quote that I found particularly useful in understanding the Armenian folk tradition, and I thought I would share it with you today. The quote by Der Hovhannisyan reads, "A minor melody is not necessarily sad unless heard from the standpoint of a Western musician." Moving on to sub-question 2, what are the core elements of South African jazz? South African jazz is an all-encompassing term, as it is used to describe a variety of different styles that fall under the genre. The styles that I refer to in my thesis are Marabi, Kwela, African jazz, Mbakanga, and Guma. Marabi is considered the mother of South African jazz, as it was the first distinctive South African jazz style to have developed in the early 1900s. Marabi had a significant influence on the development of the other styles. It initially started out as a keyboard style similar to that of ragtime, but later developed into a combo style. Moving on to Kwela music, the most distinctive feature of this style is its use of the penny whistle. While the style is highly influenced by the swing era and big band music, it employs both swing and straight rhythms. Kwela music also makes use of polyrhythms, with the most common being the 3/2 polyrhythm. Then came African jazz, which developed around the 30s and 40s and saw musicians wanting to rediscover their musical roots. The music started moving away from swing rhythms and incorporated more traditional rhythms. This style can be described as Marabi for dance band instruments. A subgenre of this style is known as Mbakanga music, which developed around the 60s. This term is often used interchangeably with African jazz as it became more commercialized and well-known. A common trait of this style is its intervallic bass playing. The last style I will discuss is Guma, which developed in Cape Town, the city that I am from. Guma developed alongside the previously mentioned styles. This style is influenced by the New Orleans marching bands, with the music making use of rhythmic figures associated with the marching band sound. The style is characterized by its rhythmic figure, which you'll hear later. South African jazz can be described as a melting pot of traditions. This is due to the various influences on the music, as well as the influence each style has on the next. There is therefore one more thing I'd like to discuss, which is the South African jazz sound. The South African jazz sound is influenced by various elements, mostly relating to the Marabi tradition, as Marabi influenced all the other styles. These elements include short 2 or 4 bar cycles of the chord progression 1-4-1-5 or 1-1-4-5. These cycles are then repeated over and over with a short motivic melody placed above this cycle. Another important feature of the South African jazz style is the aspect of unity. A South African jazz band will focus on the collective sound that it creates rather than the individual sound of the instruments. Now that you have a little more context to the styles that I explored in my thesis, I would like to discuss how I fuse these elements into my compositions. One of the most significant findings is that South African jazz and Armenian folk music share several complementary elements that can be combined in creative ways. For example, adapting traditional South African grooves into other meters. In my composition, Proteus Dancing in the Rain, this piece starts with a drum groove, which is in 4/4. This is a Guma-influenced drum groove, which is 4 on the floor with some upbeats and typically played with brushes. As mentioned, this drum groove is in 4/4, but the piece is actually in 7/8. Therefore, when the melodic motive enters, this 4/4 groove ends up being phrased across 2 bars of 7/8. The result of this groove phrased in 7/8 is 7 quarter notes over 2 bars. The strong beat therefore falls on beat 1 every 2 bars. Let's have a listen to this. Another creative combination of these two styles can be seen when adapting traditional South African harmony into more minor-oriented keys. My composition Belladonna employs this technique in its bass movements. This bass movement that I'm about to play for you is a core feature of the South African jazz sound and is inspired by Mbakanga music. The minor third movement on chord 4 is an important melodic movement in South African jazz bass lines. I then adapted this bass line into the minor key. This is supported by the Marabi-influenced drum groove, which assists in maintaining the South Africanness of the rhythm section. I also applied this technique to my tune Bird of Paradise. This bass line is influenced by the Marabi style but is in a minor key. This is further supported by a drum groove influenced by Mbakanga. Here's the traditional Marabi bass line. And here's my adaptation of this bass line played in the minor key. Making use of these combinations creates a unique but still characteristic sound. Another interesting result was how the use of Armenian-influenced melodies often results in odd phrasing when placed over grooves that emphasize the main beat of a bar. In Proteus Dancing in the Rain, the melody is placed over a 4/4 groove, which results in some odd phrasing even though neither the groove nor the melody is odd in its respective meters. Another example of this can be heard in my tune Snowdrops, where the phrasing of the bass implies a subtle 7/8 feel but remains grounded in the 3/4 time as the bass phrase starts on beat 1. Due to this bass line, the melody is then phrased over 2 bars. The rhythm of the melody forms 3 half notes over 2 bars and can be thought of as 3/2. Given this odd phrasing, along with a subtle 7/8 phrasing of the bass, it gives the B section of this piece a characteristic odd time feel, which is common to Armenian folk music. I also found the use of polyrhythms that were not defined by the drums to help develop the rhythmic motives of the tune. An example of this can be heard in my composition Poppy's Lullaby. In Poppy's Lullaby, the subtle swing created by the triplet and eighth note rhythms creates a rocking motion. Furthermore, if the bass plays a straight rhythm with the melody being slightly behind, it creates a subtle 2 against 3 and is not defined by the drum kit. This is common in South African jazz styles, especially in Kwela music. Other rhythmic effects that I used include the 4 against 6 polyrhythm, as well as displacement of a melody against the bass line. This added to the irregular rhythms. The melody in bar 31 of this tune is in 4, while the bass sticks to the 6/8 time. Further rhythmic experimentation can be seen in bar 39. Here, the motif is a slight augmentation of the original motif, although not entirely. The extra 16th notes create displacement between the melody and the bass, further suggesting a subtle odd phrasing and odd meter. Superimposing the melody of one style over the groove and harmony of another results in a new approach to these styles, further developing the context in which these genres can be heard. An example of this can be heard in my tune Belladonna. While the bass and drum groove is very much influenced by South African jazz, the melodies of the A and B sections in Belladonna make use of Armenian rhythmic elements, such as the emphasizing of beat 1. The staccato 8th note on the first beat of bar 1 results in this emphasis of beat 1. The groove is very much focused on offbeat accents, while the melody is more on the beat. Furthermore, the use of embellishments in the melody reflects more of the Armenian influence. Three compositional techniques that have become apparent through the analysis of compositions are motivic borrowing, the use of cyclic chord progressions or patterns, and pedal points. The use of motivic borrowing allows for a fresh exploration of existing ideas, culminating in more thematic development. It further places different melodies into different harmonic and rhythmic contexts, allowing for additional exploration of the sound. The use of cyclic chord progressions with pedal points creates a unifying force within the music, tying together the different cultural influences. Two of these techniques, the motivic borrowing and the cyclic chord progressions, can be heard in my composition Forget Me Not. Here is the original B section. As can be seen, the chords used in the key of D are 1, 1, 4, and 5. These chords are D major triad, and then D major triad again, and then G major triad, and then your 5/7 triad, which is A, but it's a sus chord. This progression is like the progressions used in Kwela music. Additionally, these chords are used to create a cycle, with the chord progression repeating 8 times. This is a common feature of the South African jazz style, where chord progressions are used to create short repetitive cycles. In this example, the repetitive cycle is 4 bars in length. This melody used in the B section is then used later on, except that it has been adapted to fit into the 3/4 time against a different chord cycle. The use of cycles is more indicative of the South African jazz style, while the motivic borrowing seemed to be used quite extensively across the Armenian composer Arno Babajanian's compositions. The use of pedal points is quite obvious in my tune Snowdrops. This pedal point appears at the start of the tune and throughout the A section. It provides a constant anchor on which the melody is built upon. This 2-bar bass motif uses notes of the C triad along with the extensions of 6 and 9. These extensions, which are common in South African jazz, can typically be heard on the tonic chord. While the first bar of the motif enforces the 3/4 time, the descending melodic pattern of the second bar gives more of a 6/8 feel, due to the grouping of the notes. 8 bars into the A section, the chord shifts from C to F over C for 4 bars, before returning to the original C chord. The 6th and 9th extensions are then used here as well, however, due to the implied C pedal point, these do not sound too distant from the overall chordal structure. Khachaturian also makes use of a lot of these pedal points in his writing, and so this is actually common to both South African jazz and Armenian folk music. When incorporating these findings into my compositional practice, it was important to consider which concepts to adapt or quote directly. Applying a concept to a different blends the music in such a way that the influences are more cohesive, while directly quoting a concept provides for clear tracking of individual influences. Belladonna, for instance, directly quotes a bass line that one would find in South African jazz. Forget Me Not, on the other hand, is more application-based, as the specific cycles in the tune are not necessarily found in South African jazz. However, the concept of using cycles can be attributed to the South African jazz influence. Bird of Paradise makes use of the Phrygian mode and minor second and open fifths, which is clearly of Armenian folk influence. Here, the main melody is based on the Armenian folk tune Garuna. I was influenced by Arno Babajanian's compositional style, where he directly quotes folk melodies. One challenge in creating a balance of influences was that some characteristic elements were more dominating than others. However, by carefully selecting and integrating different elements from both styles, it was possible to create a unique and cohesive sound that reflects my individuality and artistic identity. Proteus Dancing in the Rain, for example, appears to resemble more of an Armenian folk influence in the melodic characteristics, chordal accompaniment, and odd meter rhythms. However, when examining it more closely, one will notice the chord progression in the B section to be a slight adaptation to a cyclic chord progression found in South African jazz, and the gumma rhythm played with brushes is unmistakably South African. I have previously mentioned that there is no existing literature on the combination of South African jazz and Armenian folk music. However, I would like to discuss the insights gained from the literature of each individual style. The lack of existing literature on blending South African jazz and Armenian folk music emphasizes the significance of this study. Previous insights, however, from various sources have shed light on the blending of South African jazz with American jazz styles, as well as the incorporation of Armenian folk elements into Western classical formats. These sources have provided a foundation and inspiration for the blending of styles in my own compositions. The literature has also helped in understanding the differences between South African jazz and American jazz, which has allowed for a better grasp of the uniqueness of each style. The results of this study suggest that successful blending of South African jazz and Armenian folk music is possible, resulting in a unique sound that combines the best elements of both. The study contributes to the existing literature on world music and cross-cultural musical fusion by exploring the unexplored realm of blending these two styles. I would now like to discuss some of the surprises that I encountered along the way. The first point that I would like to talk about is the adaptation of 4/4 grooves into odd time signatures. Now, most South African jazz music is in 4/4, and the grooves are tailored to the 4/4 time signature. The odd time signatures come from the Armenian folk music influence, in this context. I found that the adaptation of 4/4 grooves into odd time signatures resulted in a unique and interesting sound. And this was unexpected, as I had previously assumed that the odd meter would disrupt the groove. However, it simply added an exciting layer to the music. In addition to this, the groove, as well as the melodic and harmonic figures, still maintained their authenticity. Another unexpected result was how the adaptation of South African elements into minor keys still maintained their South African flavor while also incorporating an Armenian sound. This was a surprise, as I had thought that the shift in tonality would change the character of the music entirely. This finding suggests that South African music and Armenian folk music have unique harmonic and rhythmic languages that can be adapted to various musical contexts while still retaining their distinct sounds. Furthermore, the use of motivic borrowing allowed for an incredible amount of development. This not only altered the original direction of the composition, but also enhanced their overall character. This aspect was perhaps one of my most enjoyable parts of the composing process, as it allowed for much more creativity and artistic exploration. As I mentioned previously, it was challenging to balance the various influences within the compositions, as some were simply more dominant than others. However, I found that the combination of different elements still blended remarkably well, creating a cohesive and unified sound. This unexpected result is significant to the research question, as it highlights how the fusion of diverse musical styles can lead to the creation of something new and exciting. The inclusion of jazz elements and cycles in the compositions, while not a surprising outcome, was unexpected in its implementation. This resulted in fresh and inventive ways of incorporating jazz language into the compositions. This highlights how the integration of diverse musical styles can lead to a broadening of one's musical vocabulary, resulting in the creation of something unique and original. While I discovered many new things throughout my research process, there are a few limiting factors that I feel are worth discussing. One of the main limitations of the study is the lack of existing literature on the topic. Since there is no research on the blending of South African jazz and Armenian folk music, it was necessary to rely solely on my own perspective and interpretation. While there is literature on the individual genres and how these have been blended with other styles, this mostly assisted in answering the first two sub-questions. Another limitation is that the compositions were written from a pianist's perspective with a heavy focus on harmony and melody. This sometimes meant that the more rhythmic elements heard in the drums were neglected. This also may have limited the exploration of rhythmic elements in the compositions, which could be addressed in future research. Another limitation is the tendency to reuse similar elements across the compositions, such as the more frequent use of South African grooves over Armenian ones. While this contributed to the cohesion of the pieces, it may have also limited the exploration of other possible combinations. This was also directly influenced by the lack of information available on the topic. Another point worth noting is the fact that the compositions were written for a trio. Now, this can pose a potential limitation in the types of elements that could be included. The tonal quality, capability, and roles of different instruments plays an important part in conveying the sound of a particular genre of music. As a result, various nuanced elements, such as the saxophonist's articulation, an important element of the South African jazz sound, were not included in the compositions. These types of elements may have been included in compositions for larger ensembles or different contexts. While my research has shed light on the blending of South African jazz and Armenian folk elements, there is still much to be explored in this area. Further research could delve deeper into the harmonic and rhythmic structures of Armenian folk music and how these can be combined with South African grooves and bass lines in more nuanced and complex ways. Similarly, more investigation could be done on using South African melodic elements in combination with Armenian rhythmic and accompaniment features. Another avenue for future exploration is to narrow down the specific musical elements used in the study and further refine them. For instance, investigating whether using different modes, scales, or grooves from the two traditions could yield interesting results. It may also be of value to investigate how the mix of these musical styles can be applied in other band contexts, such as large ensembles or different instrumentation, which would allow for more nuanced elements to be included. By exploring these avenues, we can deepen our understanding of the potential of cross-cultural musical fusion and its implications for future musical creativity. My research aimed to explore the potential for incorporating South African jazz and Armenian folk music into compositional forms. The key findings suggest that it is possible to create a fusion of these two genres that retains their individual characteristics while also producing a new and unique sound. In this way, there are many creative techniques to combine elements of South African jazz and Armenian folk music in compositional practice. A significant implication of my research is the potential to create new and innovative musical styles by blending musical traditions from different cultures. Exploration like this can have a valuable impact on musicians and composers, as it not only promotes individuality in one's artistic identity, but it also contributes to the broader discussion of cross-cultural collaboration and musical fusion. It highlights the importance of embracing diversity and promoting cultural understanding and inclusivity in music. My research allowed me to gain a deeper understanding of my own artistic identity and cultural background. Through this process, I was able to develop new skills and techniques in compositional practice, which I hope to apply in the future. I also plan to record and release the portfolio of compositions as a concept album to encourage this type of musical exploration. Overall, my research demonstrates the possibilities of combining elements from South African jazz and Armenian folk music, and it promotes the existence of this music in other contexts. If you would like to hear some of these compositions live, I'll be performing them at my graduation concert on Wednesday, 14 June. Thank you so much for watching.
Welcome back in the live room here at Conservatoire Maastricht Jazz Department. We've just been watching the beautiful video presentation of Rouzanna Coxson. Thank you very much for your presentation, Rouzanna. She's now standing in front of us, but we will go like the tradition demands from us. We will go first to the master research coach who has been guiding her the whole process, who happens to be online because that's Helen Svoboda from Australia, or currently in Australia. So yes, Helen, I would like to switch to you for maybe a first question you would have for Rouzanna.
Yeah, hi Rouzanna. First of all, congratulations on an incredible video presentation and project. That was just so engaging to watch, just the way that you put that all together, and it was just so lovely for me as your supervisor to hear you speak about it in such a concise way, because obviously we've been deep in thesis land, and to really hear you or watch you on the screen speak about it so naturally and passionately was just amazing. So first of all, just wanted to say that. And I'm so interested just in I guess my main question is around the way that this played out in your composition. I know what it's like sometimes when you have a specific set of materials that you're working with, and how that can also feel quite limiting at times, right? So I was interested to know how you found that process overall, like if you hit any moments where you found it frustrating or limited by thinking, oh my gosh, I need to stick with this idea because it's in the tradition, but I really want to do this other thing, and how did you kind of navigate that middle ground of the material that was informing your decisions?
There were a lot of moments like that, if I'm being entirely honest. And I picked it up pretty early on when I started the process, that it was just becoming very mechanical and that I was missing the creative side. And I found using, like, adding like a visual perspective to the music to make it a lot easier to compose, which is why I used the flower mythology. And then I also needed to just get out of my head, quite honestly. So yeah, I kind of went in that direction, and also just the more I composed, the faster I became at it. The first 3 tunes took me about 4 months, and then the last 3 that I did 1 per day. I finished all 3 in a weekend. So it really just depended. And the minute I kind of got onto got an idea that I really liked, it actually flowed better. And with telling a story, it just added that extra perspective.
Totally. And I just had one more question. That's great. And I guess talking more about as well what you just we're talking about, like the different process for each, and how some came together over a longer period of time and some came together in a faster period of time. What was the rehearsal process like with the trio? And I guess with the notations, they're beautifully laid out and very specific also in the rhythms. Obviously, it's important to have those interlocking rhythms in there. How did you find that played out over time as the material developed as an ensemble? Did you find that there were elements where you kind of departed from those elements on the chart a little bit more, or did it stay quite specific to what was on the page because of the importance of those interlocking rhythms?
So I used my rehearsals to workshop my tunes, because I knew that some of the things that I wrote maybe worked in theory, but they weren't going to work in practice. And I actually changed the compositions depending on how it went in rehearsals, and I was okay with that. So yeah, I did that, and when chatting to my band, they said with the last 3 tunes that I did that they preferred them, which I found quite interesting because I composed them in a very short space of time. But I think the less I thought about it, the better I was writing. And I just needed to trust myself. And the rehearsals were really helpful with just workshopping the tunes and hearing from the musicians what they thought and whether it worked for their instrument or not. It was very much a collaborative effort.
Totally, and it's like that idea of experimentation is like the informer of new ideas as they keep developing. So it's cool that literally played out in real time. So thank you so much. They were my main questions. I'll pass over to Jesse or Greg or Matthias.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. That's very nice. Yeah, maybe a question regarding the South African jazz sound. One of the things you ran into was that one of the conclusions drawn in the literature you found was that it had a lot to do with how to play, how to articulate, and these kind of things. Was that easy, or was that possible to draw that into your compositional process, or is that rather something for performative actions in the rehearsal process? Is it something you could use later on? Could you elaborate on that?
Are you talking about the more nuanced elements?
Yeah, like the more nuanced elements of the South African jazz sound when it comes to articulations, the character of the sound, let's say.
Yeah. South African jazz, it's a tricky one, because although it seems simple to play, it really is a feel. It's about the feel and the message that the music conveys. I've been immersed in that culture, so for me it's just something that I know, and it is actually quite literally difficult to explain. But I could use some techniques just from playing the way a pianist would maybe play certain chords, such as voicings. The voicings are very simple. They're triad based. You don't really use extensions. And the music it's dance music, so it's meant to just, you need to feel like that, and it's really about conveying emotion and just enjoying the music. I would say it's a little bit more relaxing than playing bebop. And yeah, it is quite literally a difficult thing to explain, and I did run into some of these issues with my band, obviously not being familiar with the music.
Right.
And I tried my best to convey what I was wanting, and it actually has kind of gotten there after having a couple of rehearsals and then becoming more familiar with the music. It was, I did kind of limit myself because it was a trio, so some of these nuanced elements you hear in the brass or in the woodwinds, I didn't use penny whistle, so Kwela music you might not have been able to hear as clearly, but I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. You already answered the follow-up on that one too, so that's great. But then a whole other one would be in the Armenian folk music. You ran into the fact that actually, you use the minor second a lot to represent this tenseness in the music, but actually it goes into quarter tones, right? The traditional music at least. And of course this is not something that you've been able to incorporate in the piano. I was wondering if there's something there that triggered you into a wish for exploring this possibility, or if that's really not something you feel you need.
I definitely, having lived in South Africa and being immersed in South African jazz, I have a closer connection to the music. And even though I've now done extensive research with Armenian folk music, I still feel this slight detachment because I've never actually been to Armenia.
Right.
And so I would definitely like to explore Armenia and just the music and be immersed in the culture. So it goes deeper than just exploring certain musical elements in the style and just spending time with Armenians and their music. And the quarter tones you don't get in Western notation, and it's something I couldn't really go too deep into it in my research, but it is something that I think is worth exploring, and using different traditional instruments to convey the sound.
Yeah. I mean, there are of course uses of quarter tone in more contemporary Western music, right? But maybe more interesting follow-up question here is if you're interested to use also the traditional Armenian instruments in future collaborations. Is that something that tickles you?
Definitely. I quite honestly didn't use it now because it was just going to be a little bit too difficult to kind of get together in my research.
Set up the collaboration would take.
But when I started my research, I was initially thinking of doing that. And then as I went through my research process, it just became quite more of a loaded topic than I had initially realized, and I had to just draw a line at some point.
Is there any particular instrument of all the ones that are available there that draws you out most, like that you would really like to jump on in collaboration?
I love the duduk. And it might be an obvious one, but
because it's the national instrument.
It might be, but I'm actually a recorder player as well. So I have a lot of experience in the Baroque side. So I think that the duduk would be an instrument that I could potentially play myself. Although it is a reed instrument, and I've never been very good at playing reed instruments.
Is it double reed, or it looks like a double reed?
I think so. So I would need to, but I think that I'd connect with it just from having played recorder. So
great. Looking at my left, my right, who wants to jump in?
Maybe one question about current players. Are there any musicians or jazz musicians that inspired you, that are coming from Armenia or have roots in Armenia that that you investigated?
There's one band that I really love, and they're called La Daniva, and they're actually a mix of Armenian folk music, some Balkan music, and French chanson, and they're actually coming to a concert in the Netherlands later on. They've been here before, and I've missed them every time, and I really want to go. But I love their music because it very much is appealing to the younger or the modern audience. And the lead singer is actually a jazz singer, so she's trained in jazz. And then I just love how she explores her culture through her music. And then she has a band that she plays with, and they use some traditional instruments. And rhythmically, it's quite intense, and just very cool to listen to the music. And the music videos are great because it's all about having fun, which I think is what music should be. So yeah, but they're my favorite. I've then also watched some recordings of some Armenian folk tunes that have been arranged for quartet, and that I particularly enjoyed because it had some classical components in them, but while also hearing the folk elements. Yeah.
Is there anything that you could get out of the embellishments, the melodic embellishments from Armenian folk music?
In what sense?
In a sense of trills or a sense of like melodic embellishments. That's something that I
yeah. So they use trills and a lot of auxiliary notes, and because this music it's a vocal tradition, a lot of the embellishments are more to do with how you would sing, and then the instruments kind of imitate that.
Exactly.
I didn't go too much into that because it was another big thing that I would have had to kind of delve into that I wasn't able to do, but it is definitely something that I would consider more. And I think some embellishments just work better on traditional instruments than if I were to try and play it on piano.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I'd be curious about, because you mentioned that South African jazz minor doesn't really sound minor, right? That sounds really like happy. How about the process merging South African jazz with a traditional folk Armenian? Did it feel minorish for you? For example, like merging the Phrygian, which is dark. Did it make really minor, or did you say?
It was difficult in the beginning because I thought, I'd be hard pressed to find a South African tune that's in the minor key. I think there are some, but I haven't found some up until now. So it was weird in the beginning, putting one of the tunes that I wrote, Bird of Paradise. It's entirely in the minor key, but I found that if I used a set groove from one of the styles within South African jazz, and then incorporated a bass line but just changed the notes slightly, that it still had a little bit of that kind of essence of South African jazz in it, and then had a bit of this dark sound that you would get from Armenian folk music.
So most like Phrygian, like
I used Phrygian and Dorian quite a lot. I also found that sometimes it was difficult to kind of have the same influence, just going the whole way through. So sometimes one section was more influenced by South African jazz, maybe in a more major oriented key, and then some sections were more minor or more Phrygian. So it was a kind of a combination of things. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Great.
Felipe.
I have a question. Because you have a lot of things that you need to, let's say, elements that you're taking from these two styles. When you write a song, do you start just writing a song, like, without taking into consideration the elements, and then you do like a checklist? Okay, I want the B part to have this 7/4 thing or this type of bass line, or do you start from the elements when you write?
I started my thesis. I was kind of doing, okay, these are the elements, I'm going to try and use this, but it was very mechanical. So at some point I kind of just trusted my own intuition and started writing music and just relied on everything that I've already learnt and that I know. And it was interesting because after, when I was kind of discussing my results in my thesis, I realized how much I had actually internalized. it was quite a strange thing, because I thought that I was going to have a problem and I was going to have to add in things later, but I didn't actually run into that, because I did end up having quite a lot of it. I think when you study music and when you study just when you read a lot or things like that, you do end up internalizing a lot, even though you don't think that you do. Yeah. So my composing process just became a little bit more like, I'll sit at the piano, play stuff. Sometimes it would be awful and I wouldn't use any of the ideas, and then sometimes I was lucky and there was one thing that just developed into the next. Yeah. So, yeah.
Great, Sebastian.
In the beginning of the video, you were talking about that this research is also aimed towards finding your own voice. Do you feel like you did, and to what extent do you feel like it will influence your future voice now that it's not mandatory for you anymore to restrict yourself within your compositions?
I think I did find my voice, because I had composed in the past, but just for fun. It was never something I really took very seriously, and then this thesis kind of forced me to actually do that. And I have been finding when I improvise or just play certain things that I am using more things from my thesis without realizing. And sometimes when I play, if I just sit down at the piano now, I do have little things that creep in. I think I have a long way to go still, because it is very much a start. But I definitely think I am moving in the direction of finding my own artistic identity and my own sound. And this has definitely helped, and I will continue to do that after this process.
Nice, thank you.
Great, I'm looking around.
Tizan has one.
There, Tizan. Yes.
So can I also ask about how the process was from the beginning? Because since I'm in first year now, and you know, when you have a certain topic in your mind, how did it all? When did it actually start flowing for you in terms of structural work towards your goal?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely from the second year. Okay. And yeah, definitely the second year, and the last 6 to 8 months was really where I was working intensely. Quite. Yeah, it takes some time, but I think if you're putting a little bit of effort in every week, you definitely will get somewhere. When I applied to do my master's, my thesis was very different to what it is now. I was going to do something more in the direction of South African jazz in Europe, and how it's kind of been affected, and how musicians leaving because of apartheid and a whole lot of things. And now it's a very completely different topic to what it initially started out as. And even I think from the beginning of my thesis, it's just changed quite a lot. But the process definitely starts more from your second year, I would say. I think some of the others would agree. But you can definitely start, I would suggest just starting when you can. And also, I procrastinate a lot, so I kind of had to just force myself to write a little bit, even if it was something really small. And then eventually it just kind of picked up and gained momentum, and then I couldn't stop it. And then I was too deep into it, so I couldn't like backtrack or anything. So yeah.
And did you create like the timeline already for your proposal, for example? Because and then just a sub question about the outreach program. How useful was that in your findings and probably your blog or something? How useful was that?
I didn't really stick to any of my timelines. I kind of had these set timelines, and my thesis is quite different to what my proposal was. And I ended up setting new timelines and new deadlines as I went along, just depending on how far I was. And my outreach I did recently, but I did a lecture on South African jazz, so that was. I knew a lot about it from my thesis, and then it kind of just reaffirmed that I did know the stuff that I learned from my thesis. But your outreach program, it doesn't have to be related. I just chose to relate mine to my thesis now. But I think your timeline really depends on your own topic. It's different. Different people have different things, and it depends on what you have in your topic. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Okay, we will go into a jury deliberation, and we will return with the second presentation of Manuel Regueña Suarez at 2:30. Thank you.